sa iyo na magbigay ng ayon sa nararapat na walang hinihintay mula sa iyo na mag-ibag ang di inaalintanan, mga hirap na dinaranas sa tuwing ay magsumikap na hindi humahanap ng kapalit na kaginhawaan na di naghihintay kundi ang aking mabati na ang loob mo siyang sinusundan. Panginoon, turuan mo akong maging bukas palad. Turuan mo akong maglingkod sa iyo na magbigay ng ayon sa nararapat na walang hinihintay mula sa iyo.
Bayang magiliw, pelas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituing at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 20th Jaime V. Ongpin Service in Business and Government. I am Micah Chan Gonzaga, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Ateneo Law School, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, may I request the following individuals to turn on their cameras for a photo op. Dr. Albert, Mr. Africa, Mr. De Jesus, Dr. Albacea, and Mrs. Maribel Ongpin. At this point, I'd like to inform everyone that we will be turning off your microphones and cameras for the duration of the lecture. Questions may be posted on the chat facility of your selected platform. Moreover, for better time management, speakers will be queued using this tone. Christine, the tone.
Henry, can you play it?
It's playing na po.
Ay,
There you go. The first signal will indicate the last 2-minute mark, and the second one means the speaker has 30 seconds left on his or her time. All right. To open this year's lecture series, may we call on the president of Ateneo de Manila University, Father Roberto Siap of the Society of Jesus, for his welcome remarks. Father President, the floor is yours.
On behalf of Ateneo de Manila University, I welcome you to the 20th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government. With the Philippine national elections fast approaching, more surveys and opinion polls are certain to be conducted and reported on. The topic of this year's lecture by one of the country's foremost statisticians is therefore very timely. Understanding the strengths and limitations of surveys, the impact of survey results on public opinion, and the credibility of various survey firms is key to both our personal and institutional response to these surveys. Hopefully, the insights that we will gain today will help us in further educating and informing our personal circles and institutional stakeholders. We are grateful to Dr. Jose Ramon Albert and our panel of reactors, Mr. Tomas Africa, Mr. Nico de Jesus, and Dr. Zita Albisea, for this opportunity to educate ourselves and become more responsible citizens. And as always, we thank Mrs. Maria Isabel Ongpin, who supported the lecture throughout these 2 decades, is but one of the many ways she shows her concern for our country and our people. Thank you for joining us in today's lecture, and I wish you all a good morning.
Thank you. The Jaime V. Ongpin Memorial Lecture Series is a program of the Jaime V. Ongpin Center for Business and Government of the Ateneo School of Government that was created about 20 years ago. It was envisioned to elevate the appreciation of the Filipino people of current issues that have a national impact. Inspired by the late Mr. Ongpin's relentless commitment to freedom and democracy, the lecture series attempts to enlighten business and government leaders and the citizenry through the discussion of relevant topics. To introduce our speaker for this year's lecture, may I now call on the Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, Dr. Ronald Mendoza.
Good day. It's my pleasure to introduce our thought leader and speaker for the 20th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government. Dr. Jose Ramon Albert, or Toots to his family and friends, is a professional statistician and senior research fellow of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS. He finished BS Applied Math summa cum laude in 1988 from De La Salle University and later completed his MS and PhD in statistics from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. After finishing his doctoral studies, Toots joined De La Salle University for 2 terms, then entered religious life as a Benedictine monk at the Benedictine Abbey in San Beda. His last year as a monk, he was diagnosed with colon cancer stage 2, but managed to overcome this crisis. He left religious life in 1999 and joined government service, first as a junior manager with the Statistical Research and Training Center. Then he became a senior research fellow at PIDS in 2007. From September 2012 to February 2014, he was seconded to what was then the National Statistical Coordination Board to head it as its Secretary General. The NSCB, like PIDS and the former SRTC, are attached agencies of the National Economic and Development Authority. Toots is a past president of the Philippine Statistical Association. He served as consultant to various government agencies, private firms in the Philippines, and international organizations. And Toots has worked in over 25 countries, spanning Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, the Pacific, the Americas and the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Africa, on poverty measurement and analysis, econometric methods, and survey data analysis. Toots has taught in various higher education institutions in the Philippines, including De La Salle University, the Asian Institute of Management, Holy Angel University, Mindanao Polytechnic State College, University of Santo Tomas, and San Beda College. Toots has also written extensively on poverty, social protection, education, gender, ICT, innovation, and other development issues. This year, he intends to expand his research interest to health, especially having a recurrence of colorectal cancer 23 years after his first bout with cancer. We are very blessed today to see Toots healthy and recovering and providing us much food for thought with the 20th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my good friend, one of the country's top statisticians, Dr. Toots Albert.
Thank you very much, Ron. Can we put on our PowerPoint slides? All right, maybe next slide, please. As of October 8th, a total of 302 persons already filed for 14 positions of president, vice president, and 12 senators. Although there have been some who subsequently backed out, and many of us are speculating that there may be last-minute substitutions by the middle of next month. Anyway, so even before this election fever started, polls throughout Facebook and SMS were already being conducted to determine our voting preferences for the main positions in our executive and legislative branches of national government. Face-to-face surveys have also been done by new pollsters. Even as early as January, not only to track the presidential race, but also our likely preferences for senators. Surveys have also been used by organizations to get feedbacks from their respective stakeholders. The week before candidacy applications were submitted to COMELEC, Pulse Asia released voter preferences, and pundits started giving their take on these poll results under assumptions that the daughter of the current president would or would not run. New survey outfits are coming into the scene, even relying more on ways of digital capture of data, and more polls are expected to be conducted and reported to get a snapshot of voting preferences of Filipinos. Last week, I was asked my views by Lian Buan of Rappler about Calle's survey, reportedly a real-time, real-man survey of more than 2,000 man-on-the-street respondents reportedly picked randomly in sidewalks and markets in various areas in Metro Manila and the neighboring Calabarzon. I mentioned that going out on the street and reportedly randomly picking people will not work to get a national reading or even a reliable reading of these areas, as not every voter in a city may pass through that street, and what I may think of as a random selection may not be random at all. I cautioned that media is well advised not to give credence to any polls that are not designed well to yield representativeness. This includes internet surveys. By the way, some media organizations have done these internet surveys, and other non-probability surveys which have their uses for qualitative research, but they cannot give a national reading. And speaking of representativeness, supporters of one camp has been ecstatic that their candidate of choice seems to be doing well in Google Trends. But that depends on what words you use. That can skew results on who is actually leading Google Trends. And unfortunately, big data sources like Google Trends are also unreliable for tracking national views, since first, not everyone is on the net, and second, not everyone who is on the net knows how to Google. If Google Trends data would be a good representation of netizens, which I sincerely doubt, they would at best reflect the AB crowd, which is the upper 10% of the socioeconomic strata in the country. And further, such data is likely to be inflated by trolls who are employed by all sides of the political spectrum, though perhaps some more than others because of the size of their campaign war chest. Often, we may mistakenly think that all opinion polls are gospel truth until we start noticing discrepancies in survey findings. So one of my FB friends even posted several questions. Should we trust surveys, especially if surveys only sample 2,000 respondents for a population of 63 million voters? He gave an answer that statistical theory assures a sample of 10% would be good enough, which is not quite right. He also asked who commissioned these surveys and whether these surveys are biased by who finances them, and if these surveys have a mind conditioning effect on public opinions through a bandwagon. This lecture, titled Survey Says or Not, discusses more closely the Philippines survey scene. By the way, I was invited to give this lecture by Maribel Ongpin, the widow of the late Jaime Ongpin, and I'm glad to see her here. After reviewing the science behind surveys, the lecture proceeds to identifying the people behind the several opinion poll outfits, then to describing the methods and practices used by two firms that have built track records, as well as discussing trends in survey results. Our discussions will also center on public opinions. Are they at all getting affected by surveys? The possible biases of survey results, including the challenges in survey operations, especially now in the wake of this COVID-19 pandemic. We close this lecture with some practical advice to the media and the public regarding critical reading of sample surveys and the survey outfits about the need for transparency on their methods and how they fund their operations, as these matters ultimately reflect the credibility of their data and their institutions. We start off with a definition of a survey in a more general setting than an opinion poll, which I take from a book by Robert Groves et al. On survey methodology. They say a survey is a systematic method for gathering information from a sample of entities for the purposes of constructing quantitative descriptors of the attributes of the larger population of which the entities are members. The term systematic differentiates surveys from administrative reporting systems, big data, and other ways of gathering data. The phrase sample of appears in the definition, since some surveys which involve selecting respondents with chance methods attempt to measure what is happening in the entire larger population. The quantitative descriptors called statistics are headline summaries describing the attributes of, actually their estimates of the corresponding attributes of the larger population. For instance, the percentage of voters who will vote for a certain candidate. The alternative definition I give on the slide comes from the UNECE, which is quite similar. Surveys, in short, are used to gather knowledge and gain insights to analyze human behavior and welfare, thoughts, and opinions. In the Philippines, surveys are used as data sources for many of our official statistics, meaning statistics released by government, especially on pitik. Pitik meaning presyo, trabaho, kita. Prices, jobs, income. For instance, when the Philippine Statistics Authority or PSA releases every quarter the growth of our gross domestic product or GDP to describe the country's economic performance, This is actually based on a monthly survey of establishments, another survey of firms that's done quarterly, a survey of farms, as well as other data sources. The same goes for statistics on unemployment and underemployment rates released also by the PSA. These are based on quarterly surveys called the Labor Force Survey. The PSA's inflation data is, on the other hand, based on a monthly survey on prices. And the PSA isn't the only producer of statistics in government. We also have the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, for instance, that tracks consumer confidence from its quarterly expectation survey. In the private sector, market research and opinion polls are conducted to generate various measures that are important in the business sector and the general population, such as the monthly Purchasing Managers Index, that is a leading economic indicator. Measures of satisfaction with products and services by consumers, approval ratings, voting preferences. The latter two will be discussed in more detail in this lecture. And we also have surveys done by students and faculty in higher educational institutions to generate data for undergrad and graduate thesis and faculty studies. Educational institutions affiliated with hospitals also conduct surveys on healthcare. As we will see, and we will learn in more detail today, there are a number of advantages for conducting surveys, including the relative ease of administering these surveys. A survey can be designed in less time compared to other data collection methods. Surveys can be cost-effective, though the cost can depend on the survey mode. A survey can be administered not just through face-to-face methods, but also now remotely via online, mobile devices, email, and even digital interviews. During this pandemic, firms that have been regularly conducting face-to-face surveys have started to experiment with the use of digital means of interviewing and capturing data. A survey is capable of collecting data from a large number of respondents, and we can ask many questions about a subject, giving extensive flexibility in data analysis. With the use of survey software, data can be readily tabulated, and we can also come up with all sorts of graphs, especially when your questions are put on what's known as a closed format of categories. And also we can do advanced statistical techniques and models that can be utilized to analyze the survey data to determine the validity, reliability, and statistical significance, including the ability to analyze multiple variables all at the same time. A survey can also have the potential for generalizability, particularly if probability methods or chance methods were used in sample selection. We can be assured of reliability of data if a survey is designed and done well. But not all surveys are done equally well in practice. And there are also disadvantages with surveys. Some survey errors can result from deficiencies in coverage and non-response, question wording, interviewer effects, and social desirability. The reliability of and accuracy of survey responses may depend on several factors. Respondents may not feel encouraged to say their honest, socially acceptable, and undesirable attitudes and behaviors, and may thus over-report on more desirable attributes. For instance, some survey respondents may not be willing to admit they prefer one candidate, and so they might lie and say they are voting for another candidate. Respondents may also not be fully aware to a question because of lack of memory on the subject. For instance, how old are you? Sometimes I myself forget, how old am I? Or even boredom. Non-responses may seriously erode also the reliability of aggregate results in a survey. In a questionnaire, options to a survey questions could also be unclear to respondents. For example, the answer option somewhat agree, may represent different things to different people and have its own meaning to each individual respondent. Yes or no responses can also be problematic. For instance, when I ask, are you literate? In other words, can you read and can you write in a certain language? Respondents might just keep saying, yes, we can read. Again, because of social desirability biases. Why will you admit that you don't know how to read to someone you don't even know? Survey questions can be inflexible and the results may lack depth unless these are followed through with qualitative research methods to probe on survey results. And finally, survey results can be misused and abused. There are several challenges in designing and implementing a survey, including making decisions on how to identify and select possible sample respondents. Some targeted respondents may be hard to reach or reluctant to respond. Questions need to be evaluated and tested before you do large-scale survey operations. Decisions need to be made on the mode for posing questions and collecting responses. For instance, at the start of the pandemic, as I mentioned, collecting data face-to-face was not allowed. And even now that it is allowed, there may be questions on whether we could rely fully on data capture through digital means, especially because not everyone is digitally connected. Also, interviewers need to be trained and supervised. Data files, when put together, need to be checked for accuracy and internal consistency. Survey estimates may also need to be adjusted to correct for all of these errors, including non-responses. The gold standard in conducting surveys has been to select respondents randomly so that they can roughly represent a proportion of the entire population, as in the case of simple random samples illustrated in, can you show the next slide, please? In the second rectangle. Okay, the second rectangle where 20% were randomly selected. There are also other designs such as cluster sampling, which breaks the population down into groups, and then you sample from these chosen clusters, or stratified sampling, where a random sample is drawn from each of the strata, or a combination of cluster and stratified sampling, as is shown in this slide. Regardless of the design, the sample results can be used for inference to the entire population if you make use of probability methods in choosing respondents. NSOs such as the PSA, the National Statistics Offices like the PSA, whenever they conduct household surveys, typically select respondents in stages. At the first stage, they divide the country into what is known as primary sampling units, something like villages or barangays. Then they select some of these barangays or PSUs using chance methods. Then within the selected PSUs, they select their secondary sampling units, which might be the dwellings or the households themselves, again, using chance methods. Surveys of businesses, on the other hand, involve stratifying firms into large firms, all of which are interviewed, and then MSMEs, which are sampled proportional to their sizes. I have encountered people who are surprised why polls only make use of 1,200 respondents, even if the population is 100 million. Of course, politicians especially would be the worst critics of these polls because they think the only numbers that matter are the counts on election day, especially if the poll results are not in their favor. I keep telling people, if you don't believe that sampling works, next time you go to a hospital, tell whoever is extracting your blood, don't extract just a blood sample, extract all your blood if you don't believe in sampling. Okay, well, seriously, why do polls make use of 1,200 respondents only if, in fact, the targeted population, as in the case of the number of voters, is in the millions? Statistical theory suggests when we are trying to estimate a percentage of voters in a population, the estimate from a sample has a precision called a standard error that is dependent both on the true value of this proportion as well as the sample size, but not the population size. In particular, the standard error can be approximated as being inversely proportional to the square root of the sample size. In other words, if you want to double the precision of a random sample, we would need to increase the sample size by 4. And in particular, if we want to control the margin of error to be within 3 percentage points, which means we want to be near the true value within that margin, we would need, just by calculating, you can just do your algebra directly, we would need a sample of 1,111, which rounded up is to the nearest 100 is 1,200. My Facebook friend suggested that a sample size of 10% would be good enough. Not quite right. When a probability survey is conducted many times, the values generated for these sample proportions will certainly vary, but they will still be relatively predictable. Statistical theory suggests that big N, the population size, has nothing to do with the determination of sample size, small n. A sample size of 1,200 will guarantee us that we will be, 95% of the time, we would be yielding an estimate within a margin of error of 3 percentage points, which is why opinion polls use about 1,200 sample respondents. You can try, get the 1 over the square root of 1,200 and you'll get an answer of 0.03. To put it another way, we would expect a less than 3 percentage point difference between the proportion of people who say yes to a survey question, will you vote for ISCO? And the proportion of people in the population who would say yes if asked. We would increase the sample size to yield a smaller margin of error, but we have to also ask to do a cost-benefit analysis because the value added for precision for an increased sample size, is it worth the cost? For opinion polls, a sample size of 1,200 seems to be doing a fairly good job in predicting the true estimate unless the elections are very close. Aside from sampling errors which result from the use of a sample rather than a full census, there are actually a lot of things that influence the survey. And I identify here in this graph 6 sources. The questionnaire itself, which might be too complex, the respondent, who may not want to be truthful, the interviewer, who might influence the responses of a respondent, the information system of a respondent, the mode of data collection, and even the survey setting itself. For instance, if I were to ask just even a question to a respondent, how old are you? The respondent may have a defective memory like me, or may not be able to find his or her birth certificate to validate his or her age. Now, in various points in time in the history of the United States presidential elections, polls have provided clues on who would win, but there have also been disasters in forecasting elections with polls. Way back in 1936, the Literary Digest, a very well-known magazine in the US, conducted a survey of around 2.4 million people. The Digest erroneously predicted that the then incumbent Franklin Delano Roosevelt would lose to challenger Kansas Governor Alfred Landon 43% to 57%. Actually, Landon received only 38% of the total vote and the Digest went bankrupt after. At the same time, George Gallup set up his polling organization and correctly forecast Roosevelt's victory from a mere sample of 50,000 people. But his forecast was that FVR would get 56% of the vote, of the popular vote, when actually, it wasn't 56% either. A post-mortem analysis of the Literary Digest revealed what's known as coverage errors arising from selection biases. The Digest list of respondents was taken from a telephone book, magazine subscriptions, club membership lists, automobile registrations, and inadvertently, they were targeting well-to-do voters who were predominantly Republican and naturally had a tendency to vote for their candidate Landon. The sample had a built-in bias to favor one group over another. In addition, there was also a non-response bias since the targeted number of respondents was 10 million, but only 2.4 million actually responded. So we have a response rate of 24%, far too low to yield reliable estimates. Thus, we can see from this story that even if you have a large number of respondents, it cannot cure procedural or design defects, but will only repeat the errors over and over again. And of course, much closer to the present, in 2016, election forecasters like Nate Silver and even institutions like ABC News, New York Times, all said Hillary Clinton will win with 70% to 99% probability and pegged her to be the favorite to win even states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that in the end were won by Donald Trump. 4 years earlier, Nate Silver gained a lot of fame in election forecasting, but he also made a big error in forecasting. They were all wrong because they were basing their conclusions from state polls and they were aggregating results. And it turned out there was a systematic overestimation for the Clinton vote in the state polls. People who responded to the polls are not necessarily a representative sample of the voting population. So that's the long story short, okay? I won't get into too many details anymore about this exercise. You can just read it on the net to find out. Again, do a little bit of research on your own. Okay, let me go to the next slide instead. Some people, like my Facebook friend, go far as even asking whether the public can get manipulated because of all of these polls. There might be a bandwagon, or you might give your vote to an underdog, among others. This is why in a number of countries, laws or regulations attempt to control how opinion polls are reported, or even whether they are permitted at all. In Montenegro, for instance, opinion polls are forbidden. On voting day, it is even forbidden to publicize the results of previous elections, believe it or not. As far as evidence, however, on the effect of polls on public opinion, the long story cut short is that the literature on survey research is mixed. And this is why in the Philippines, even if we do have a law to regulate election polls, as I will be mentioning later, we do not ban them. In my humble opinion, it's not surveys that really influence public opinions per se, but the campaign tactics that make use of these surveys that do. However, surveys have various errors, deviations from the true values, and which are better referred to as statistical or measurement errors. To differentiate these survey errors from simple mistakes, and it is important for all of us to understand all of these errors. Darrell Huff, in a 1953 classic book on how to lie with statistics, chapter 10 on how to talk back to a statistic, suggests that we should be asking the following questions. First, who says so? In other words, who conducted the survey? Who paid for it? Second, how does he know? How was the survey conducted? Third, what's missing? How many respondents were interviewed in this survey? What was the margin of error? How were the questions asked? Fourth, did someone change the subject? In other words, can we find the descriptions of the data and conclusions in the survey report? Are they actually based on the data? And finally, fifth, does it all make sense? What assumptions are made in the survey report and the survey data analysis? We will discuss all this again in the context of our regulations on election surveys in a while. But before I do that, let me also point out that the pandemic changed our ways of doing things even in collecting data. And as the next slide shows, surveys which are typically administered already in face-to-face mode, but there are now new ways of administering interviews using low data collector involvement, such as emailing the questionnaires or making use of even artificial intelligence robots on social media. Face-to-face interviewing has been the main mode of survey administrations in the Philippines in the past, where typically a trained interviewer would go to the home of a respondent who is being interviewed standardized questions and whose answers are being recorded, or for instance, maybe with pen and paper, or maybe even now on tablets with direct data capture. While interviewers can build rapport and motivate respondents to answer conscientiously and disclose sensitive information during the interviews, and they can observe the respondents' non-verbal language and circumstances. However, in face-to-face mode, interviewers intrude into people's homes and schedules, spending time and resources traveling, and have to be non-threatening to the respondents as they probe about potentially embarrassing opinions and behaviors. Respondents have to allow a stranger into their homes, must be prepared for a social encounter, and may not be able to multitask while answering, and even may feel embarrassed to respond to some socially undesirable questions, such as, did any member of the household ever experience physical or sexual violence from another member of the household? Or is anyone here doing drugs? Amid hard lockdowns last year, face-to-face surveys were not allowed. And in the midst of our increasing use of technological gadgets, we have alternative modes of survey administration to this face-to-face approach. Results of recent studies suggest that for some respondents, what are known as asynchronous interviewing modes can reduce the interviewer's social presence, will allow respondents to participate while they are mobile or multitasking, and it turns out it could result in higher quality data and greater respondent disclosure and satisfaction. But the problem remains in the Philippines that not everyone in the country is digitally connected. So at best, we would only get the pulse of the upper 60% of the socioeconomic stratum. With that said, let me now discuss the Fair Elections Act in the country that regulates election surveys. These election surveys are allowed if they are published more than 15 days before an election for national candidates and more than 7 days before an election for local candidates. The law mandates a candidate, political party, and polling firm to release the relevant information like who paid for the survey, who conducted the survey, what is the methodology, what areas were covered, what were the specific questions asked, and the margin of error. It also mandates, for transparency purposes, that the survey, together with its supporting raw data, be made available for inspection, copying, and verification by COMELEC, a registered political party, or a candidate, or by any COMELEC accredited citizens arm. I asked my research assistant, Mika, to help me identify all the polling outfits in the Philippines. And she managed to have a list of 11 of them. Ibon, a CSO that focuses on development issues. Octa Research, which has gained fame for its advisories on the pandemic. DigiVoice, a new firm that intends to use digital tech for opinion polling. Publicus, a lobbying firm. Boses Pilipinas, a new player from the academe. Stratford, a consulting firm. Another consulting firm, Lilo Research Strategies. Two radio networks, Manila Broadcasting Company and Radio Mindanao Network. And of course, these polling outfits have conducted all these election surveys at various points in time. However, the most two famous polling outfits that have lasted for decades, which maybe most of us or all of us might know of, are SWS and Pulse Asia. Can you go to the next slide, please? headed by Linda Guerrero and Ronald Holmes, respectively, who are also now in the, I think they're part of this lecture. Da had only recently taken over the mantle of leadership in SWS from Mar Mangas last month. SWS was established in 1985 by Mahar and several fellows, including Pepe Miranda, who quit from SWS to establish his own group, Pulse Asia, and subsequently gave the leadership to Ronnie Holmes several years ago. Let me disclose that I'm an elected fellow of SWS, but that is largely honorific. The only benefit I get from being a fellow of SWS is I get the emails regularly about Mahar's columns as well as advisories on the reports of SWS. How exactly do these organizations survive? They do run dedicated surveys and charge people and institutions for subscriptions to survey results, and they also have commissioned surveys, and they also conduct various market research studies and consultancies. In their websites, there's a lot of transparency. You can get information on their dedicated surveys, their election polls, their methodologies, which I will be summarizing in a while. While how they conduct their surveys is pretty much the standard way that I described earlier. They design their surveys and questionnaires, determine appropriate sample sizes, select areas for operations, conduct the survey operations, process and analyze the survey data, and finally communicate the results to the public. Survey questions by SWS and Pulse Asia appear to be fairly similar for voting preferences. Sino po ang inyong boboto or sino ang pinakamalamang ninyong iboboto? There are also extra rider questions that subscribers might pay for, such as, suppose we have only a four-cornered race among candidate A to D, who would you vote for? No? Where the two organizations might substantially differ is on measuring the performance of government officials, because SWS considers the term satisfaction, while Pulse Asia uses the traditional concept of approval. Although there's some relationship between these two concepts, but they are clearly not equivalent, and this accounts for the variance, if any, in their survey results to measure the public's view of the performance of government officials. Does question wording really matter? Well, actually it does. As far as back as 1941, Donald Rugg published a two-page article, 2 pages, in a Public Opinion Quarterly, reporting on a test of 2 questions about speeches against democracy. He did what is known as a split ballot experiment. Half were randomly selected and asked, do you think that the US should forbid public speeches against democracy? 54% of the respondents said, yes, the US should forbid public speeches against democracy. When the other group was asked, do you think the US should allow speeches against democracy? 25% said yes. In other words, 75% would not allow the public speeches. So the question is, what is it? Is it 54% or 75%? Now, both Pulse Asia and SWS interview about 1,200 respondents for many of their surveys, 5 respondents per sample spot, with the respondents chosen through a multi-stage probability sampling scheme. Outside the NCR, provinces are selected, although a little bit differently. Then within each selected province, barangays are chosen, then the households within the barangays, and finally, an adult respondent is chosen, stratified by sex in the sample household. And because they use 1,200 respondents, their margin of error would be 3 percentage points. Getting a reading in the 4 areas, NCR, Balance, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, would give only a reading that is good for 6 percentage points margin of error, because at these areas, the sample sizes would just be 1/4 of the national sample. And thus, the precision would decrease by a factor of 2 from the national reading. In each selected sample household, a respondent is chosen randomly from among household members who are 18 years and older using a probability selection table. And as I mentioned, respondents are stratified by sex. Having discussed the methods and practices of our main polling outfits, which actually generate a wealth of information beyond election data, let me now show you some of the results and trends of their surveys related to the performance first of the president across time and the readings of voter preferences for elections. First, let me turn to SWS satisfaction ratings and Pulse Asia approval ratings of the country's chief executive. The current president has been given very strong support and satisfaction with regards to his, quote, pamamalakad. According to SWS, the perceived decisiveness and diligence are reasons for the high ratings. When we look at the corresponding approval ratings and trust ratings monitored by Pulse Asia, we see a similar pattern, though the levels aren't quite the same owing to differences in the concepts of satisfaction, approval, and even trust. We notice when we compare the ratings of Duterte, the current president, with past presidents, they are among the highest tracked ever post-EDSA. The lowest performance was given to Gloria Arroyo, whether in terms of satisfaction, approval, or trust. What I find interesting in the next slide and amazing is that despite the differences in concepts of satisfaction and approval, when we look at the net satisfaction and net approval ratings, the figures and trends come very close to each other. Further, we can notice that we tend to have honeymoon periods with all our leaders, even with Gloria Arroyo, who got the lowest approval and satisfaction ratings. Only Duterte appears to have maintained this popularity, although some suggest that the most recent data would indicate the start of a crack. Duterte's worst year for approval ratings and satisfaction appear to have been in 2018 to 3 years ago. The June 2019 survey was conducted right after he called God stupid. And then the September 2019 drop was after a rice shortage that led to record high inflation, but he bounced back in 2019 and maintained popularity even in 2020 amid the pandemic. When I was talking with foreigners in my travels prior to the pandemic, many people from the West were puzzled why a country that is predominantly Roman Catholic would give him such high popularity. One person even told me, where is the consistency between your religion and the approval you give to the killings in your drug war? What explains the high approval for Duterte? The survey data will not tell us directly why people approve or are satisfied with the leader's performance, or why these aggregates are changing even across time. Pundits can think of conjectures and interpretations of the data. In this case, for instance, some political observers like Randy David, John Nery, Oscar Lagman, Luis Tudor, among others, have attributed the very high ratings for Duterte to a fear factor. In a webinar held last month organized by SWS, fellow Geoff Ducanes says, let me quote, "One can also ask, how much is driven by fear of expressing dissatisfaction so that what is observed is not real satisfaction," unquote. Ideally, survey respondents should feel secure to disclose accurate information, including opinions, during a face-to-face interview. But a growing amount of literature in survey research discusses fear in survey responses. In Africa, for instance, and even, believe it or not, the US, where as much as 62% of Americans say they have political views that they are afraid to share. And 32% are worried about missing out on job opportunities because of their political opinions. Studies in Africa suggest that the presence even of a bystander would affect survey responses. Studying the presence of bystanders and the fear it can yield to survey responses is important because oftentimes, especially in developing countries like ours, third parties are present, where extended family members and communities live in close proximity. I'm also reminded of a relatively new survey research that points out that when we're looking at how complicated survey responses can actually get. if you ask a respondent information about asset ownership, you can get very different information depending on whether you ask several persons in the household or if you just ask one person in the household, and who that person is will matter. And this is just about asset ownership, not even about opinions. Going back to the conjecture that fear affects survey responses, particularly on approval or satisfaction, Ronnie Holmes, who's also part now, I saw him earlier and he said hi, and several, so Ronnie Holmes of Pulse Asia and several fellows of SWS all admit that fear cannot be ruled out. However, the measurement of fear is quite challenging. Both Pulse Asia Senior Research Fellow and Executive Director Ana Tabunda, as well as SWS board member Stephen Rood, said that there are currently no non-verbal signals from their respective respondents that are supporting this conjecture of a fear factor. Still, it's worth pointing out that 51% of Filipinos in the SWS July 3 to 6, 2020 National Mobile Phone Survey agree that it is dangerous to print or broadcast anything critical of the administration, even if it is true. But this might just mean that Filipinos think it's dangerous for the media to be critical, but they can still freely say what they want. As I was ending actually the content of this lecture, I was informed that Ronnie Holmes, together with Yuko Kasuya of Keio University and Hirofumi Miwa of Gakushuin University, delivered a paper at the Philippine Political Studies Association annual meeting last June 15, where they presented the results of an interesting list experiment. In short, they found empirical evidence through a Pulse Asia survey that about 1/3 of the Duterte's approval ratings came from social desirability bias, particularly respondents not giving truthful answers in surveys as of early 2021. Further, Filipinos who believe their neighbors support Duterte were more likely to succumb to this social desirability bias. The implications of this fascinating paper would suggest that support for Duterte may actually wane when people perceive he is no longer as popular, and that a high support for authoritarian populist leaders should not be interpreted as an indication that voters have just given up on democracy, as some pundits have argued. While I'm not a psychologist or sociologist, my own interviews with ordinary men in the street, men and women, which I do as a former Benedictine monk who is trained at listening to both verbal and non-verbal cues, suggests that the president is really very popular. And one of the main reasons for this has to do with our desire for strong leadership and the hope that we will have our version of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew, who can transform the country into a much more prosperous one with fast decision-making. And this is why I suspect people can sometimes be very nostalgic about the days of Marcos and even are very supportive of the return to power of the Marcoses, as they remember these days as the days of a lot of infrastructure built, roads, the CC complex, to name a few. This need not be exclusive of an appreciation of democracy. Some of us may think that these ideas may have been influenced by propaganda. But whether people's views are factual or not is beside the point. What I try to understand is how people think. I first suspend my judgments on morality and view instead the opinions as not black or white, but just being different from mine, maybe just coming from their respective needs and opinions. And interestingly, the analysis of Geoff Ducanes supports my conjecture about the desire of Filipinos for a strong man, which I developed simply by having decent conversations with people. Since surveys are not the only ways to collect data, you can have detailed interviews of key informants and even focus group discussions that can be opportunities to probe the minds of people. Geoff Ducanes suggests, from an attempt to model explanations of the approval ratings, that people who saw Duterte as decisive, diligent, and authentic, especially the first two traits, were more likely to be satisfied with him. Besides being authentic to a number of people, Duterte, who is viewed as the familiar Canto Boy Doming Tigaso, or Rodrigo de Tigaso, whatever, is entertaining. And of course, we Filipinos, we love entertainment. The model of Ducanes uses perception of character traits of the current president, was reported to correctly predict 99% of those who were satisfied and 45% of the dissatisfied respondents. I would suspect that geography also matters, as my conversation suggests that those originally from outside Metro Manila who are peeved at Imperial Manila are likely to be strong supporters of the president, especially if they're from Mindanao. This was validated also by Geoff Ducanes, though the model's explanatory power here was not as strong as the earlier model I explained. Some of us who have been very critical of the pandemic management of the administration may find it puzzling. Why is it that we don't have a bigger proportion of people who disapprove of the president? So many think maybe the surveys are all wrong. And then we start becoming critical of SWS and Pulse Asia. However, again, when I talk with ordinary people in the street, barbers, Grab drivers included, I sense that many people really are very happy with government because we provided an ayuda. People I interviewed say something is better than nothing. And further, the pandemic is a global problem, so we cannot just blame Duterte for this pandemic. I noticed there's a lot of empathy for the president, who is viewed as a fatherly figure, really a tatay, with some semblance of the FGD results conducted by Pulse Asia that revealed a perception of President Duterte as being very hardworking because he makes speeches late at night. Although that was maybe several months ago. We don't know whether that continues. No? The SAP or ayuda of national government was meant to reach 75% of all households throughout the country. And results of the DSWD post-distribution monitoring that I'm now putting on the slide here suggest that a large proportion of beneficiaries were satisfied with the ayuda. The DSWD monitoring report that suggested regions giving an average satisfaction ratings for the amounts given, the timeliness, and the implementation, ranging from a low of 71% in Ilocos to a high of 92% in Central Visayas, despite the many stories we hear of in social media of implementation deficits of the ayuda. We tend to be, after all, a happy people, easily pleased. Allow me now to turn attention to data on voter preferences. First, on who Filipinos wanted to vote for as president in 2016. In September or October 2015, the then Vice President Jojo Binay and Senator Grace Poe were the most preferred, but neither of them won the elections. Rather, then Davao Mayor Rodrigo Roa Duterte won. And interestingly, when we look at the last election surveys done by both SWS and Pulse Asia, we see how both firms managed to get a very accurate reading of who actually won, as well as the rankings of the presidential balls come May, although Duterte's 39% in election day was a little bit underestimated. That may be partially on account of the huge OFW votes that were on his favor and which were not figured into the polls. Grace Poe landed a close third next to Mar Rojas. The share of Jojo Binay, who had landed fourth, appears to have been overestimated by Pulse Asia, which conducted its poll much earlier than SWS. Sample sizes used for both polls were 3 to 4 times the regular sample sizes used, yielding supposedly smaller margins of error. One could hypothesize that there might have been some social desirability biases, maybe even in the vice presidential race. Chis Escudero, who was early on the front runner, ended up number 4. No? And his share of votes in the polls were also overestimated by both SWS and Pulse Asia. The close fight between Leni Robredo and Bongbong Marcos was tracked by the polls. And if you examine trends in the election preferences for vice president, although I did not show them here, we would also see how the polls managed to capture the increasing trends for Leni Robredo, who at the time may have benefited from the machinery of the Liberal Party, which was then the administration party. When we look at the election surveys and outcomes in 2010, we similarly see the accuracy of forecasts of SWS and Pulse Asia for the winner of the polls. The estimates of the shares for then candidate Noynoy Aquino were quite close to the actual share in the elections, with SWS doing a better job than Pulse Asia again. But of course, we should note that SWS had its poll conducted a little bit later and much closer to the election day than the Pulse Asia survey. Both SWS and Pulse Asia overestimated the share of Manny Villar, who came in third, and underestimated the ERAP votes. Again, we might think that there might be some social desirability biases here if respondents were not willing to admit their preferences for ERAP and even for Jojo Binay, whose share was also underestimated. Election forecasts put Gloria Arroyo in the 2004 elections winning, although the gap between her and nearest rival Fernando Poe Jr. were actually much closer than the polls could detect, on account of a smaller sample size used in 2004 compared with 2010 and 2016. The polls in 2004 managed to forecast accurately Noli de Castro winning, with SWS again picking a closer fight, which is again correct, likely on account again of the conduct being much closer to election day. How about the accuracy of polls in forecasting the winning 12 senators for 2019? I'm not sure why SWS did not conduct election surveys in 2019. I only got data for 2018. But anyways, their September 2018 listing of the top 12 senators was much poorer in forecasting than the Pulse Asia survey, which was done very close to the elections. No? But if we look at the historical data also for 2016 and 2013, or even next slide, 2010 and 2007, we will see both organizations managing to do a fairly good job in identifying the top 12. Just like the voting preferences for president and vice president, senatorial preferences were also changing and wobbling across time. Why they were changing was clearly an effect of campaign strategies of the candidates and various events that could trigger changes in preferences. As I close my discussion, I would like to point out that both SWS and Pulse Asia have been collecting not only approval or satisfaction ratings and also voting preferences, but a rich set of other data. Let me just show you one set for SWS. They have hunger statistics, which during the Pinoy and Duterte administration displayed a decreasing trend, although the pandemic changed the course of this trajectory. The May 2021 hunger rate of 16.8% is double the December 2019 pre-pandemic level of 8.8% and complements many of the government statistics on the country's poor economic performance amid the pandemic, including rising unemployment. As regards Pulse Asia, let me just show you one interesting set of data they released that I think did not capture as much attention in the news, but it gives very good clues on what all these campaigners should be doing for the campaign. Pulse Asia data shows 9 out of 10 Filipinos use television as its news source, and less than half are using radio or the internet. Internet penetration is estimated at 63%, much bigger in NCR, 83%, and least in Mindanao, 47%. And with internet penetration correlated to socioeconomic class. In other words, the higher your ranking in socioeconomic classes, the more access you have to the internet. These data have also been more or less generated in surveys of government, particularly the latest 2019 Functional Literacy and Education and Mass Media Survey of the PSA, as well as the 2019 National ICT Household Survey conducted by our DICT. And all of these show by and large that television is still king. and that we have a big problem with our digital divides across locations. Pulse Asia reveals a lot more about internet use of respondents, which is also consistent with the NICT-HS results of the ICT. And what many of us know of those who have internet access, particularly everyone is on social media, especially Facebook. But only less than half use social media for the news, and even fewer use it for news on the election. And one of the really interesting results here is that only 1 out of 5 Filipinos on the net are using internet messaging apps to discuss the elections with family, close friends, and co-workers. So in other words, the bottom line is television is still king. So likely TV ads, possibly debates, and coverage in the news will be the main battleground. While we now have a majority online, more however in NCR and among the AB crowd, we might be just hearing our echo chambers. In other words, we might be just be chatting with like-minded people than with those people who we disagree with when it comes to politics. So, and often we don't even want to discuss politics. Imagine 4 out of 5 don't discuss the elections. So in my humble opinion, we need to get it clear to our heads that we will not likely be able to change the views of people on Facebook who are our friends and they have a different view of the elections. We cannot change their voting preferences. If they will change, it will happen because of television and not because of our discussions online, where we just tend to prefer to talk with our like-minded echo chambers. Some key takeaways from this talk. First, survey data says quite a lot if we are willing to listen. And if these surveys are designed and done well, many times we dispel poll results because they don't conform to our worldview. But forecasts of election results appear to be fairly accurate, especially if the polls are done a month before the elections. SWS and Pulse Asia offer us a lot more than mere voting preferences. They also give us data on how we rate the performance of our leaders, hunger statistics, and a profile of internet social media use in the country. Unfortunately, not all of these get equal time in the media. Surveys may not offer explanations on opinions and why opinions change, but we can have conjectures and validate this with conversations. Those of us who are puzzled about the high approval ratings of Duterte may want to check out the lecture of Geoff Ducanes in the SWS website, as well as the fascinating paper of Ronnie Holmes and his co-authors about the social desirability biases in approval ratings. All firms that are conducting polls in the Philippines should be transparent about their methods and funding, not only because that's what's written in the law, but also because that can help or destroy the credibility of your organizations and your surveys and ultimately statistics. I am hoping Mores, we have someone from Mores here, and also the Philippine Statistical Association Incorporated, can come up with a joint accreditation of firms that are conducting surveys to guide the media and the public on what firms are doing a good job and what aren't. We risk having the public lose trust in statistics and surveys because some surveys are just not representative, but yet they are presented to the public as though they are. For instance, as I mentioned earlier, we have a Calle survey that claimed to be a random sampling of more than 2,000 people in the streets in Metro Manila and nearby areas. But that's not really a probability sample. It's an accidental sample. There's value in this for qualitative research to probe the reasons for voter preferences. Or consider another poorly done survey conducted by one of the firms I mentioned earlier. I will not elaborate which, but their website mentions that it was a nationwide purposive sample of 1,500 respondents drawn from a market research panel of over 200,000 firms, Filipinos, maintained by a Singaporean-based firm. However, no details are given on the SG firm or how sure we are that this 200,000 Filipinos in the market research panel is representing the entire voting population, on why purposive sampling was used. And I suspect that's why the figures actually that were released are so different from the results released by Pulse Asia just a few weeks earlier. Non-probability surveys, including these internet surveys conducted by some media organizations and the surveys I just mentioned recently, cannot be compared with probability surveys, which are designed to represent the country's voters. Finally, how can we talk back to surveys? First, the public needs to be critical, but not overly critical of surveys. There are errors in surveys, sampling errors, and non-sampling errors that lead to differences in what a survey says and what the actual outcome is. But well-designed surveys can give a more or less fairly good snapshot of what people think. Politicians and their supporters are advised to be open to accept survey results of these very good surveys, even and especially in times when they do not show you are ahead. But such a portrait should help you fine-tune your campaign strategies. Don't shoot the messenger. Use your kokote. Finally, to those of you who are working in the media, please, 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 I hope you develop more skill sets to understand survey results and their limitations. That ends my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert, for that very incisive and very passionate lecture. Before we proceed to hear from panelists, we would like to invite the members of the audience to submit any question or comment on the chat facility of the pertinent platform that you are using to access the lecture program, whether it be on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube. When doing so, please indicate your name and any designation you may have in the institution or group you belong to. We will ask Dr. Albert or the panelists to whom the question or comment is directed to respond to as many of them, consolidated and summarized. May I call on Mr. Tomas P. Africa, former administrator of the National Statistics Office, to give his reaction.
Thank you, Attorney Maita. Can we put up my slides, please? It would be difficult to follow that comprehensive, energetic, and passionate lecture of Toots Albert, but then let's move on. Next slide, please. I'll talk a little about the government surveys because that's the reason why I was invited by Dr. Albert. And then I'll talk a little about the surveys, what surveys say, so what do you do after, and then move on to voter registration. And maybe because I've been cooped up in quarantine, so I think there's the possibility of demographic and digital divide, and a rough estimate of what how many votes to win for the presidential race. Next slide, please. Okay. The Family Income and Expenditure Survey is a nationwide survey of households. It's undertaken every 3 years. There are 2 rounds, January to June and July to December. It measures levels of consumption and spending pattern of Filipinos and sources of income, levels of living, and disparities in income of Filipinos. It has a questionnaire of 80 pages of 2,700 data items. The budget allocation for the 2018 for the FIES was 260 million, or close to $5.2 million US. There were 180,000 households constituting the sample. And so the per capita interview cost was like $30 or 1,500 pesos per interview. Next slide, please. We have the labor force survey, which generates statistics on levels and trends of employment, unemployment, and underemployment. There is a nationwide sample households of 42,000 for the quarterly round, and I think 11,000 for the monthly round. It is core questions for the monthly LFS include generate indicators by province for the COVID-19 recovery program. Can we move on to the next slide? I'm just showing you that this is how you develop the survey design. Over at the left column, you see 75 province domains, 6 small provinces, 31 highly urbanized cities. So there is an intention to generate estimates for these specific locations. And for per round, quarterly round, there's about 43,000 sample households, sample units. Let's move on to the next. I'm showing the Pulse Asia sampling scheme. You might think that just because there is NCR, Balance, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, that they don't go through the regions. They do. And they select barangays per region, and then the level of the barangays, then they select the households and the respondents. And that composes the 2,400 respondents. Let's move on. Next slide, please. So for a private sector opinion polls, I would just say that, maybe you just need a sample teaspoon of lugao, for instance, to find out whether lugao is delicious or not. But when you handle government benchmark surveys, it's like having a brutal feast, and a sample teaspoon or sample spoon will not be sufficient. So you need to get sample handfuls. So that would explain the variance or variation between the sample sizes of opinion polls and government benchmark surveys. Next, please. I just posted this and say, okay, you get the results. Why not, rather than go and castigate the survey outfits, why not heed the results? They may be pointing out the good and the bad. And they really, probability surveys, they are not meant to preach to the choir. I remember in one forum for the vice presidential race, they were asking why this is so. And I said, well, you just trace the progress of the proclaimed winner. And this was made possible because they were tracking it, and the strategies, I think, that they put up were effective. Next slide. Again, using the slide which was presented by Dr. Albert, absolute levels may please the cordon sanitaire. Like for June 2021, you had 75% satisfaction of the president. But then the trend might be more important because satisfaction a few months before was up at 84%. So there's been a decline, which has not been really seen in previous surveys. And you can see already the handling of the pandemic might be a factor in this development. Next slide, please. There was a survey by SWS on whether the president will run as vice president and whether it violates the intention of the Constitution. 60% said it does. Only 39% say he should run. One columnist said, well, that's almost the same percentage that elected President Duterte in 2016, who are in favor of a VP bid. And then Pulse Asia in October 5, I think, released the rating of the administration, which fell 10 points in terms of its efforts at fighting graft and corruption. So did anyone change electoral plans because of this? Was there a VP candidate who suddenly became a presidential candidate? Is it because of that? Those are things that maybe you should think about, that surveys do have a say in terms of strategy. Next, please. I just posted this because surveys can give you a longitudinal picture. So like April 18 to 20, President Duterte had 33%. During the exit poll, it was 39% already. So it's never static. I mean, once you track it longitudinally, then you get some history, and it's very effective for strategizing. Next, please. The same holds true for the vice president in 2016, the race. You can see that they were changing, especially during the last few months. So next slide. And then the exit polls conducted by SWS, you can see that it was at 46%. In February, 46% had made up their minds, but 8% did decide, 12% in April, 15% in the first week of May, and 18% on election day itself. So like 3 months before the campaign period, only half had really were very sure about their choices. And finally, the voters and COMELEC really have the final say. Next, please. Is there a demographic divide? Is there a digital divide? Is there a new normal? Why don't we think out of the box? Next, please. Look at these boxes. In 2019, 61.8 million registered voters. And in 2019, there were 63 million number of adults. So it's like almost a 98% coverage in terms of voter registration. Now, as of July 2021, it was 60.5. And sometime early September, it was getting closer to 62 million. So are we heading towards 100% registration of Filipinos 18 years old and over? Or will it be more? Shouldn't this be a concern of electoral watchdogs and even political parties? Thank you. Next, please. Young Filipino voters may make a difference, they say. It's 52%. So 31.4 million are in the age group 18 to 40. So is there a demographic divide? What could be the reason why people were lining up early in the morning and following quarantine protocols? Was this because of citizen obligations? Was it a reaction to the handling of pandemic, political moves, or I'm just being paranoid? Next, please. So if you're looking at the young voters, they would belong to the millennials and Gen Z. I would skip. I will run out of time if I explain this further. So next slide, please. Are there similarities between working and non-working millennials and Gen Zs? So that's another thing that you would need to examine. Next, please. The presidential candidates, actually from Robredo up to Lacson, they're really baby boomers. Bumagosa and Pacquiao are below 50 years old. Marcos Jr. is 64, Ronald De La Rosa is 59, Robredo is 56. Will it matter? Will this have a bearing? So next, please. I just posted this just to show that we cannot rely on just Facebook, on social media, because there 47% of individuals use internet, and about 18 to 60% of them use the internet. 79% use cell phones. So 18 out of these 18 to 34 years old, then heavy users will compose 90%. So is that a digital divide that we're looking at? Next, please. Will this matter? It's something that may be answered later, but I think we should start thinking about this, because I feel that there's a difference between the boomers and the millennials in the way they approach problems and look at solutions. Next, please. 20 million if you're looking at a 40% share of votes. If you are looking at a 50% share of votes and get a majority vote for the winning president, then 20 million for a 50% share of votes, it will be 25 billion. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Congratulations, Dr. Salaman Albert. Thank you, Ateneo University. Thank you, Mrs. Ongpin. Thank you for this annual memorial program, for inviting me. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you, Mr. Africa. May I now request Mr. Nico de Jesus, Director and Head of Advanced Analytics
Hello. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for having me this morning. I was invited by Dr. Albert to discuss the topic of what we value very much in MORES. MORES is the Marketing and Opinion Research Society of the Philippines. MORES was founded about 35 years ago to nurture and craft, to nurture the craft of marketing research and analytics. We are a group of professional marketing research practitioners who align with global practice standards such as the SMR. So in 8 to 10 minutes, I hope to give a good reaction to the lecture, but coming from the point of view of MORES. No? Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So in a gist, we totally agree that surveys are a critical representation of democracies. It has its limitations, but the issues are culture-wide. And the call to action is no less than asking a change or a fix in the culture. And I would like to offer some action plans. Next slide, please. Surveys in the world is the voice of the people, especially in democracies. Surveys thrive in societies that value and representing people's voices. Decision makers listen objectively to what's being told in this particular tool. And it allows access to things like behaviors, channels of communication, as what was described by Toots earlier, geographic spread, etc. And most importantly, attitudes and mindsets and heart sets, things which change very rapidly at the different strategies given, for example, by politicians and marketers alike. Items which can change very fast in an increasingly complex world, and technologies fast changing. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Okay. So I'm very glad that we established the premise. No, we do surveys for democracies, for free speech. Just as marketing is the context of usage of surveys, politics is the context for election-related surveys. Governance can be said to be broader, to be the broader area that covers business, government, NGOs, etc. And every voice matters. It's about representative feedback. So the science of arriving at representativeness is very critical. There is a craft to be honed for this, and in marketing, business, rake in the benefits of careful collaboration amongst the stakeholders. It's not just one stakeholder, it's multiple stakeholders. And no less than world organizations such as the European Society for Marketing Research and WAPOR, the World Association for Public Opinion Research, espouses this. Now, tarnishing the image of scientific surveys is an erosion of the best tool available for decision makers and policymakers, which is why MORES has been very active, especially in times of elections. Next slide. In fact, next slide. In fact, the last time we did something like what Toots just did was in 2016, and we've been doing this every election year. In this particular year, we were closely collaborating with the media organization, the Philippine Press Institute, and we covered NCR, Baguio, Iloilo, Cagayan de Oro, etc. Key points in the cities where we talked to universities and media practitioners, and told them in a day's time, with workshops, lectures like what Toots gave, statistical principles, etc., what it means to understand surveys. And we also underwent workshops for writers to do pieces that focus not just on horse race discussions of who's leading and who's not, but also discourses on issues that matter. Things like what do you feel about the economy, what do you feel about gender equality, etc., etc. Okay, and this was a clamor from journalists. Next slide, please. Now, as Toots mentioned, surveys as tools have limitations. And as pointed out in a Hong Kong study that was done in 2012, it's always unsatisfactory samples. It's always about telling the survey results and so on and so forth. No? The next slide will summarize it simply for you. The next slide. It's about representation and presentation or communication. And in 2016, we zoomed in to media as the one that needs addressing. No? How they tell the story, how they explode the story, how they spin out of the numbers, etc. However, that's not the case anymore. Next slide. We're now finding out that this involves the entire ecosystem of users, doers, and storytellers. So you can see that the ones who has the funds, who are the users, are the ones who dictate the objectives and how to use the particular surveys, not just the politicians. It could be the marketers, it could be the government, it could be just about anybody who would commission a survey. Of course, there's media, and of course, there's the research academia and research practitioners. So it involves everybody. They define the standards, they define the benchmarks, they define how it should be done. Next slide. Okay. So as you can see, it's not just next slide. Okay. So if in 2016 the focus of Morris was media, now the realization is that it's the entire value chain. Those who do it, those who tell it, those who use it, and at the end of the value chain are those who create the perceptions or the public. In the end, consumers get impacted either as receivers of policy in action, poor products or services, at worst, confusion. In 2016, together with the Philippine Press Institute, there was a clamor for journalists to increase the discourse about issues, not just our personalities of who's leading or lagging. Next slide. Thus, bad surveys done by misguided media, unprofessionally done surveys, introduces misrepresentation that they get, a sense of helplessness in a supposedly democratic setting. More mistrust in any culture translates to unconnectedness, at least as governance is concerned, which is appalling, considering that we are awash with data in this day and age of big data, yet can also be swimming in badly collected opinion data. Next slide. So what I'm trying to say is that this builds a case that we need to get the best of surveys that will multiply, trickle, cascade 10 years into the future, 20 years into the future. As analytics, data science, and technology compound, we need to build compound, and to build capacity, we need to start the groundwork as early as possible. We need to address the issues from a cultural standpoint. If the culture accepts, lives, breathes science, even in democratic citizen life, then the values of scientific surveys becomes very apparent. The value shared from producers to communicators in media, as well as users. Next slide. So the call to action is to build a culture of doers, users, storytellers, using surveys for positive change. Doers, such as research agencies, samplers, field interviewers, they should be doing the surveys right and respect respondents. The result that we can expect is our harmonized and professional standards, which is what we're trying to observe with SMR and WAPOR. Media, tell the story right and well. Result that we are expecting from them is to more discussion about issues-based surveys. Amongst users, we expect them to understand, to listen, and decide based on results, because there are many users who decides on action or policies or products or services without using the survey, ignoring the results of the survey. And last but not least are the public. We want them to be more empowered. We want them to have a critical mind, short of saying community of citizen scientists. Next slide. Okay, so that's the vision that we're trying to paint. This takes off from Tut's last slide. What has to be done? It has to be no less than this vision, where we have a culture where communities, stakeholders of citizens and can understand and advance the benefits very actively, as what is happening in countries like Norway, Switzerland, for example, and other progressive countries. No? So they're building up a capacity for citizens who are actively using surveys for community development. Okay, next slide. So short-term action. Next slide. Is to socialize and best practices, guidelines, and checklists for users and public media. We need them to know the good from bad surveys, inform media, publics, users, politicians, why science is right, why the science works, how it works for representativeness, and why it's good for democracies. Show actionable surveys that can translate to sharpening of issues, not just personalities, and eventually policy reform. Lastly, jumpstart a conscious collaborative effort to show that good surveys work. We need reason to believe. While, for example, the Johns Hopkins dashboards are really exciting to look at, they're not exactly surveys, in fact, they're censuses. The global action, it motivates for global feedback is working at its best. You know, everybody working together. Okay, next slide. So what I can contribute is for example, best practices and guidelines. This is what Morris is espousing. The Morris has ethical guidelines. The Philippine Statistical Association has guidelines. SMR has this. It has handouts working hand in hand with the World Association of Public and Opinion Research. So this is, for example, the link where you can download these guidelines. In London, you have the Marketing Research Society and also the International Statistical Institute. Next slide. So guidelines which will give you things like this. This is already the collapse form, but you can see who conducted the poll and who sponsored the poll. How many people were interviewed? When were they interviewed? What were the dates of interviewing? What were the questions? How were they phrased? Were they balanced? Were they properly rotated or in proper order? Is it representative? Is it random and representative? Is it just random but not representative? So these are key points that we need to ask and make people understand early on. Next slide. This is a handout we distributed in the 5 key cities in 2016 to journalists. So it's a quick and easy checklist of what to look at when assessing or evaluating survey producers. There are the mandatory questions that falls in what you call the data box, and there's those which are preferred but not mandatory, like technical questions such as sample size, margins of error, etc. Next slide. So this is one example of the data box that we're encouraging media practitioners to use, and anything that falls out is subject for scrutiny. Okay, next slide. So we want to equip users with what to look for on online panels as well, because this is now the day and age of digital. SMR has, for example, the SMR 38. They call it the SMR 30. It started like SMR 10 in the 1990s. It became SMR 25 in the late 2000s. And now they have like 37 questions. Now, it's not a checklist anymore. They are guide questions for the user and the owner of the research to ask the respective vendors. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so things like what's the company profile of the online panel producer? What's their sampling and project management protocols? Do they comply, for example, with GDPR or data privacy? Next slide. Okay, now medium to long-term action plans that we recommend along these lines. Next slide. Is to start building up groups and publics of survey-savvy users via trainings. such as what we can probably do together. You know, Ateneo, PSAI, MORES, Philippine Statistical Institute, etc. We need this because accept it, no? We have a data culture. We do things the same way in a data way. We do Facebook, we do internet, and we do surveys. And this is the way that we will be contributing to our data ecosystem 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And this requires seeding also citizen science users of surveys in communities, LGUs, business and academics, and all stakeholders that I pointed out earlier. We need to sustain the reason to believe, track and share that it works. Next slide. Okay. So at MORES, and I'm sure we can do this also in Ateneo, we can also do this in different communities, in Cagayan de Oro, for example, or Baguio, name it. We have very bright students out there. We can start something like a training program where we can debate, where we can curate best practices. Okay, next slide. Short of asking, a culture of data scientists. Why? Because that's how it is right now. You go to banks, you have finance scientists. You go to marketing, you have marketing scientists. In matters of country, why not a culture of citizen science for better lives? Okay. Next slide. So we need to seed citizen science users for surveys in communities because everybody now has access to data. What is lacking is a discernment of what's good data from bad data. Things like sampling methodology, statistical thinking. What's the time period when data was taken? Who analyzed it, and to what extent was it analyzed? And who vetted it? Was there peer review when you did it? And at the end, what action was done, and did you do the right thing? Next slide. So data culture possible? Definitely. We for example, harmonized classification code we call the OneSec. It was a 10-year effort, but we were able to do it. And what this says is that it will take time. Popularization of surveys, joint collaboration across the different stakeholders will probably take time, but we have to start now. Okay, next slide.
Hindi naririnig?
Hi, sorry. Yeah, hello. Yeah, hello.
Yes, Mr.
Next.
Jesus, please go ahead.
Okay, next slide. This is the last slide. In the end, we have to show people that it works. We need to sustain the RTB, or the reason to believe, and we have to track and share community level surveys in, let's say, a community dashboard. It's the only way for people to see that and be aware and conscious that these things work at the community level. And if you can make that possible, no respondent will refuse a survey because they know that they have something in it for them. Okay. Next slide. So to summarize, surveys are critical tools for representation, especially for democracies. Science benefits multiple stakeholders in terms of feedback, but there are limitations. There are limitations in terms of how it's done, how it's told, and how it's used. Unless we address this across the different stakeholders, these limitations will persist. Worst case, it will erode. And in fact, for some countries, lead to embargoed surveys, no? Which is bad for feedback. So the issues is not just media, it's not just statistics, it's culture-wide. And the call to action is to address or build the culture because there's no other way. It's like learning a language at a different level. So action plan, short term, socialize, advocate, and equip the stakeholder. Long term is to seed communities with survey savvy and citizen science members who can participate in this effort. Next slide. So yeah, the only way to do it is to get it done together, starting with good survey understanding. Okay, next slide. And that ends my reaction. Thank you, Dr. Albert, the Jaime V Foundation, Mrs. Ongpin, Ateneo de Manila, for this timely and much needed lecture. Mabuhay po kayong lahat.
Thank you, Mr. De Jesus. May I now invite our third and last reactor, Dr. Zita Albacea, professor at the Institute of Statistics of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, for her own remarks.
Okay. Good morning to all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Yes, I'm Zita Albacea, professor from the Institute of Statistics, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. The views I'm going to give are my own and not of the university to which I'm affiliated with. Also, I'm telling you my affiliation so that you will know where I'm coming from in relation to this in relation to my reaction to Dr. Albert's lecture. Before proceeding, let me first thank my friend Dr. Toots Albert for nominating me as one of the panelists. Likewise, my special thanks also goes to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Next slide, please. The lecture has given us insights. What can survey give us? And the main takeaways include that survey results do say a lot. The results are very rich with information that could be utilized by many according to his or her purpose. Statistics from a poll survey are needed by politicians and their supporters in planning a strategy. Each poll survey results can provide signals on how to proceed and act on the forthcoming election. Specifically, the media people can also use the survey results to report the appropriate information. And in general, the public can use poll survey results to make the right decision. Technical people must scrutinize the methodology used by those conducting the surveys in order to give the appropriate advice on the usability of the results. Next slide, please. But after the lecture, there are still questions that linger in my mind. Do we know how to interpret the survey results? Are the politicians and their supporters know how to use these statistics to plan their strategies? Are the media people know how to extract information from the survey results? Are the public in general know how to use such results in their decision-making process? Next slide, please. So the questions that point to the ultimate, these questions point to the ultimate one. Gets mo ba ang results ng survey? In general, the answer is no, because we Filipinos are not statistically literate. Statistical literacy is defined by Gall in his paper as the ability to interpret, critically evaluate, and communicate about statistical information and messages. Note that it is different from being numerically literate. We can be numerically literate, but not necessarily statistically literate. Thus, we cannot expect all Filipinos to follow the survey results and use these statistics appropriately, unless we do something for them, as advocated by Mr. Nico, to make our population more statistically literate. Next slide, please. Some of the things that we have already done to improve our statistical literacy. Among the youth, we have required basic statistics course as part of all academic programs in a higher educational institute. A good example of this is the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, wherein almost all of the academic programs take statistics as a basic course before the K-12 era. No? Even the BS Development Communication students they take statistics courses. No? Now, After which, several years ago, we started with the K to 12 curriculum. Now we have moved, in fact, I'm one of them, and Dr. Albert is one of them, moved to have help the DepEd in, or help the DepEd and the CHED in having a statistics subject or statistics as mathematics subject in the K to 12 curriculum. And it is actually placed as a mathematics subject in grade 11 or grade 12. However, problems occur as we usually have problems in its initial offering. The problem occur in terms of the subject matter coverage. The descriptive statistics are only the topic that were discussed in most of the high school or senior high school classes, where statistics became part of their curriculum. No? The more important area, which is inferential statistics, which we are actually doing or using in decision-making process, was left out. Maybe because there is lack of time, or another is because there is a lack of teachers to handle the subject matter. Now, what we are trying to move, as we try to move on, we are planning to develop a GE course in statistics or a general education that will improve statistical literacy and require the students of all academic programs to take it. No? Now, we also need to have some actions for the adults. No? So next slide, please. We can improve the statistical literacy through trainings, webinars, seminars about statistics or about surveys, no? As mentioned earlier. We can include basic statistics training as a component of our continuing education. Training institution like the Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute offers basic and advanced statistics training, which is actually taken by most of the government employees or government agencies as part of their continuing education. Some private companies also ask PSRTI for this kind of trainings. Also, the academe like Ateneo, University of the Philippines, LaSalle, can also offer training or webinars or seminars to improve the statistical literacy of our people. Professional organizations like the PSA, Philippine Statistical Association Incorporated, and the MORES can also offer trainings on the use and interpretation of survey results as well as they also in particular, PSA Incorporated offers training on how to teach statistics, especially for the senior high school students. So we are not only training the students, but we are also training the teachers so that they can impart the basic of these, maybe conducting surveys and maybe interpreting results, so that there will be a multiplier effect. Next slide, please. So together, we must aim to make every Filipino voter to be statistically literate, so that he or she or our one and wana can make the right decision at the right time. So together with, I'm supporting the advocacy of those of most of us here in the statistical community, that we must make each one of us or each of our Filipino or each of the Filipino to be statistically literate. And I think that's my last slide. Next slide. I'd like to thank you for the time you shared with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albacea. May we request Dr. Albert to respond to to give any reaction he may have to the remarks of the three panelists briefly?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that Butch Africa pointed out that there's a very big difference in a way, in the benchmarks of government surveys as far as sample sizes. They have much bigger sample sizes compared with those used in opinion polls. But that's really traced to the purposes of these surveys that are meant for policy intervention, to give attention, especially to subnational data. And I fully agree with Butch that as far as the polls are concerned. It's important that data users, especially those in the campaigns, developing campaign strategies, need to understand, get insights on the dynamic behavior of opinions. That way they can fine-tune their campaign strategies. And for instance, as Butch pointed out, they have to know the difference between what the voters, your different sets of voters. You have the young voters, the millennials and the Gen Z, even maybe even further working versus non-working, as against the baby boomers who might have a different view altogether, a worldview, no? But unfortunately, right now we keep arguing, especially on Facebook, about the elections, which I find a bit worrisome, because we just my sense is that the more we argue with people, the less we're actually going to change mindsets. We just propagate our echo chambers, because the reality is we have a digital divide. Nico pointed out that we have all of these surveys that consider the issue of representativeness, and over again we've been doing this. We have, for the past several decades already, we've been trying our best. But the only thing is the advent of social media seem to have propagated further all of these fake news, including I wouldn't say fake surveys, but not very well done surveys that are being propagated by propaganda. And unfortunately, media and even data users in general don't understand. They can't differentiate between reliable data use sources from not so reliable ones. And I'm glad Nico has identified that there be need for both short-term and long-term solutions, medium to long-term solutions, to improve the data ecosystem. Unfortunately, we need to be more systematic. And I'm glad Sita particularly started chiming in about, this gets na ba ni Juan at Juana, because really that's what it all boils down to. We can have all of this data, but at the end of the day, do people understand what exactly this data mean? And unfortunately, it's media that sort of becomes the go-between. And again, unfortunately, while I agree with Sita that the higher education institutions and the education sector in large part has done its job trying its best to improve statistical literacy with before there was a basic course in college on statistics. Now there's a stat subject in grade 11. But unfortunately, where I don't see the impact of this right now, it seems that in fact I sense that there'll be a need for us to be much more systematic in the way we build capacities of people, because right now we have measurements of what we mean as functionally literate in the survey of PSA called the FLEMS. There's also a digital literacy measurement in the DICT's National ICT Household Survey. But what about statistical literacy? How are we measuring it? I don't think we have any measures right now. What we just know is on Facebook, people are misusing surveys. I see it. I keep correcting people, even Facebook friends, but it goes one end of the ear and goes at the other end. No matter how I keep telling them, this is not a good survey. You shouldn't even be citing it. You shouldn't be comparing it with nationally representative surveys. And many of these people are even educated. So I'm wondering what's wrong. So clearly we are unable to penetrate to really improve literacy. And that's the main insight here. I'm also glad that Mahar has pointed out, has corrected me, that the Fair Elections Act, indeed, there was some portion of the act that was unconstitutional, apparently because, this is a question of free speech. So right now, there are no longer any provisions about the 15 days, etc. No? So Mahar had pointed out this on the chat box. Thank you very much, Mahar Mangas. Thank you.
All right. There are a couple of questions, but in order to give time also to our audience to post questions in the chat facility, if you have any pressing questions for any of our speakers, Please do so now, and remember to indicate your name and any designation you may have. We have a few minutes for questions. But while we wait, my apologies, we had issues with the photo op earlier. So may I request the following individuals just before our open forum to turn on their cameras for another photo op. So Dr. Albert, Mr. Africa, Mr. De Jesus, Dr. Albacea, and Mrs. Maribel Ongpin. Are we okay?
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so there are only a couple of questions, and I think that this may be due to the fact that the lecture of Dr. Albert, as well as the comments of the panelists, were really very comprehensive. We have one question here from James Tolosa, who is a political science student. He says, currently writing a research on the effects of social media exposure on voting behavior. And he asks if it is advisable to use polls as a way to measure the effects of social media exposure on voting behavior. And let me just ask Dr. Albert the second question so that you may see which one you wish to respond to first. Paano makakatulong yung survey sa matalinong pagpili ng candidate? How can the ordinary voter use surveys as tool for making intelligent decisions, choices during elections?
Maybe just for the first question, very briefly, that will really be all up to SWS and Pulsation. Other organizations are doing the surveys if they think they can make use of it. Try to measure your the effects of social media through doing national surveys. But the second question, paano magagamit ang survey para makapili ng maayos na taong pipiliin nyo? Actually, hindi naman dapat yun eh. I mean, ito siguro yung sinabi kanina ni Nico De Jesus, no, na nakikita lang natin sa survey kung sino yung lumalamang, no, pero hindi natin alam kung bakit sila lumalamang. Kaya dapat nagkakaroon ng diskusyon. Hindi lang yung survey, yung data na ito, pinapakita lang yung snapshot kung ano yung nangyayari ngayon, kung ano yung views ng mga tao, sino ang mas lumalamang sa mga tao. Pero hindi niya sinasabi bakit, no? Sana mas maganda nga tanungin yung mga tao muna, bakit nyo binoboto si ganito? Bakit gusto ninyo ito? Yun yung mga dapat na conversations natin. Hindi lang sa survey matututunan yan. Yan ay dapat sana nagko-connect tayo, nag-uusap-usap tayo. Yun yung sinasabi ko na ang pag-uusap rin sana natin, hindi lang sa Facebook. Kasi sa Facebook, away-away lang. Parang mga balitaktakan. Pero wala namang nangyayari. Hindi natin nako-convince yung mga undecided people o yung mga taong dahil sana lang, no? Sana ang ating mga kandidato talagang ine-explain nila yung mga plataforma nila. Yun sana ang magiging paraan para tayo ay makapag-desisyon ng maayos kung sino ang dapat nating iboto. Hindi yung survey mismo ang magsasabi sa atin kung sino ang iboboto natin. Kung hindi, mamili tayo depende sa platapormang binibigay ng ating mga kandidato. Maraming salamat po.
Mr. Africa, would you wish to add to that?
Thank you, Attorney Maita. Remember that Facebook can be manipulated. Facebook determines the algorithm wherein they choose the people who will be within your circle. So if you see in your pages the color red or color pink or color green, you're not really talking nationwide. You're just really looking at your circle of friends. And note that there is really a divide. There's still a lot of people out there who needs to be, issues to be explained to them. If it's possible that there will be a face-to-face at some point, then it's still necessary because in a very tight contest, 1 or 2 percentage points will be very important. Thank you.
All right. we do not have any other questions on the platforms. So perhaps at this juncture, I'd like to request Dr. Albert and our panelists, if you had any last words, like a minute or less, that you'd like to share with the group before we close the program, that would be great. Maybe we can go with Dr. Albert first.
Yeah, well, I just got a message. I've been getting, while we're talking there, I was also getting messages on Facebook from so many people, including Ambeto Campo, who was my former confrere in the Benedictine Abbey, by the way, as a monk. No? Then there's also a colleague who said, he liked the phrase, use your cocote, you know. But really, that's my point. You know, all of these surveys, they're telling us a story, except that we don't listen. You know? We're so obsessed with what we think, and we are not listening to what the data says. Of course, there's a point there that the data isn't really telling the entire story. Why are people selecting this candidate over another candidate? The surveys are not telling us the story. But that's why we need to have conversations with other people. So don't always think that surveys alone will tell you everything. They won't. But it has its value. No, so the only question is, what are the good surveys and what are the bad surveys? I hope media and the general population should start becoming more discerning that there are some good sources, that there are some not so good sources. And so, you know, if you think that all surveys are wrong, well, you know, I think you need to tone down a little bit. Some surveys are actually doing a very good job. And so if you are looking at these good surveys, by all means, try to understand what these data are telling you. But do not think that all surveys are wrong. Some are really wrong. I mean, not wrong, but they're not well designed. So be more discerning, especially the media, because you have a very big role to play in informing the general population. And unfortunately, right now, I'm a bit worried because people don't seem to understand. They can't discern what's real from not real. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for final remarks, but we have two questions na pahabol. So maybe these can be taken into consideration as far as final remarks are concerned, Dr. Albert and the rest. We have one from Guillermo Luz. There was a chart which showed good surveys leading to strong democracy. What about the reverse, the impact of bad government or governance on survey reliability? So that's the first question. And the other one is directed specifically to Dr. Albert, asking for his take on online polls and the infiltration of trolls in conditioning users over their preference over one politician, on their preference over on one politician over another.
May I?
Mr.
Number
Africa, right?
one, probability surveys are far more superior than non-probability surveys, especially in terms of nationwide coverage. Please listen to that point. And second, impact of governance on surveys. Well, I myself was afraid to all this time to talk openly because it might mean that my barangay would be quarantined or locked down, or my friends will not be given ayuda. So whether you're able to cover that or not, it's really very obvious there is an impact on governance in terms of affecting the tenor, the mood of the environment of the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. De Jesus or Dr. Albacea, do you wish to
I'd like to comment on the I'd like to comment on the second question. What's the effect of bad governance on surveys? At first, I think it's independent, but truth to tell, in 2016, in one town in Baguio, for example, they were scared and afraid of what they would say in either a survey or an interview because of this particular mayor. And I think that lends some insight about how bad governance can affect good surveys. When I first encountered SWS, that was in the people power days, that time people were really scared about talking, and yet SWS did their jobs and left out how many percent of people are, what are the attitudes at the time. So I think they're independent. The research outfit did its job of making its point and open to the public, open to its readers about the percent of people who feel oppressed. No, so I think they're independent. It's the danger, however, of doing surveys in a oppressed environment that is dangerous, no, for practitioners and respondents.
Thank you. Dr. Albacea, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, actually, I agree with what they have said regarding the effect of the governance to surveys. But we must also think that we use the results, or we use data to make the good decision. So it's really difficult for us to practice statistical thinking or inferential statistics if we do not have this good data, no? So that's why I still advocate for people to learn how to use statistics, to learn how to use the numbers for their in making the right, or not necessarily right, because what is right might not be right to them, no? What is right to me might not right to them. We're making a decision, no? So you try to as an advice to each one of us, that we try to use the results of the survey in making a decision. Okay, that's, I think, what I can share with you.
All right. Thank you very much. My apologies. I omitted, or I failed to mention the person who asked the last question. That was Leona, chairperson of Quezon Province Pride, asking about online polls and the infiltration of trolls. So perhaps we can see the last chance to provide final remarks to our lecturer for today, Dr. Albert, before we close.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could just mention two things for the two questions. One is, years ago, I happened to be, as was mentioned by Ron, the Secretary General of the then National Statistical Coordination Board. We released the poverty statistics. We analyzed a survey done by the then NSO, National Statistics Office. And I know at that time, speaking of governance, the then President, Noynoy Aquino, was not very happy with me particularly and the NSCB, because we said that poverty statistics did not change. But those are the numbers we've got. We don't kill the messenger. But in fairness to them, that was his initial reaction. He was not very pleased. But in fairness to him, they made many changes in their plans and programs. So it's the question of what will you do with the data? No? It can lead to good governance. It can lead to bad governance if you ignore the data. No? Second, as far as the question of internet surveys, I already said it partially. They're not probability surveys. So I think media and all of us should just ignore of these online surveys, if for that matter. If they're not probability surveys, they will not give us a national reading. However, if these online surveys are giving some clues on why people are voting for someone over another, then go ahead, start examining it. But most of the time, just ignore it, because it will just confuse us, and it is one of those things that actually they're not very good, well-designed sources of information. So I call specifically, there's some media organizations that did these online surveys. They shouldn't have done this in the first place. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today. We wish to advise everyone, though, that Dr. Albert's lecture will be posted on the university website, Facebook, and YouTube pages later in the day. And at this juncture, perhaps I can invite Mrs. Maribel Ongpin to close the program with her remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Jose Ramon Albert, and to our panelists, Tomas Africa, Nico De Jesus, Sita Albacea. Really, we have had an education, maybe the first little step into statistical literacy. Surveys for elections need informed judgment from the public. You have to insist that we acquire those skill sets, particularly as mentioned by Dr. Albert, the media, because they are the ones who are publicizing and making a racket about it. The second thing to say is what Dr. Albacea said, that you don't make your judgments or your vote on the basis of surveys. You make your own judgment, okay? I mean, surveys tell you what people think. Now, elections define our future, so they must be approached with defined values that we want to see in the present and in the future. In this age of so much connectivity, and I'm not on Facebook, thank goodness, there's much to distract, including what is meant to inform or to convince, to create public opinion or foster bias. All of the above come to the fore during an election campaign. One of the particulars are the use of surveys, which we have discussed today. Having said that, I would like to congratulate our speakers and the Ateneo de Manila University, especially Jeng Maglalan, who's done so much work, Dr. Mendoza, who made the introduction, and Attorney Gonzaga for being the facilitator, which against many odds has, including this pandemic, has successfully mounted the 20th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture. And a word about Jaime Ongpin, who has gone to the other life 34 years ago this year. He fought for what our country has from time immemorial wanted, a true democracy with equal opportunities for all in a society where merit can be rewarded. And if it is absent for reasons of lack of opportunity, education, livelihood, it can be compensated by the care and compassion of those who have it for those who do not. In this way, we become the same, equal and united Filipinos in a better society. Thank you to our audience and all who have all these years attended this annual memorial lecture in the name of a Filipino who cared for this country and his Filipino and his fellow citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Ongpin. And thank you to all who have joined us for this year's Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture. We end today's gathering, as we always do, by asking the help from our Blessed Mother to place us always closer to her Son.